Welcome to the Book of Mormon Evidence Podcast with host Rod Meldrum. This week's Come Follow Me supplemental study is Lesson 19, Mosiah chapters 18 through 24. We have entered into a covenant with him. This is part 2 in Amberli's presentation on ancient sacred Jewish symbology in the Book of Mormon.
So going to one of the next ones. Now, this is one of my favorite ones.
Okay. Where are we going?
Wayne May and I were for a number of years, we take people to go see one of the most astounding sights in all of the Hopewell culture, interaction sphere, basically, which is in Newark, Ohio. Mm-hmm. There's a place it's called the Great Octagon and the Great Circle. Collectively called the Newark Earthworks, basically. Mm-hmm. And we would take people out there and we would show them these amazing works, and they had the ditches and they had these earth banks and everything. We'd talk all about how they had these amazing like circles and squares and octagons and roads or paths between these places and so forth. And we thought it was just wonderful. And then you came along.
Yeah.
And now a little bit of understanding. With Amberli's understanding of Hebrew symbolism, she began to come to a realization. Oh, let me give you the page. It's page 250. Okay. This is from the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon, page 250. And what I want to bring out here is the fact that because of their having the brass plates and because of their living these laws of Moses and so forth, they understood things that really no other religion. One of the things that separates the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from really any other religion is our understanding of the purpose of life and how this all goes down. Yep. How this all plays out, and that's all called the plan of salvation. Yep. And in the Book of Mormon, he actually talks about this, and this is from Alma, and this is chapter 24. And this is, go to verse 14. So Alma 24:14, it says, And the great God has had mercy on us, and made these things known unto us, that we might not perish. Yea, and he has made these things known unto us beforehand, because he loveth our souls as well as he loveth our children. Therefore in his mercy he doth visit us by his angels, that the plan of salvation might be made known unto us as well as unto future generations. Mm-hmm. So what does that tell us? It tells us that, number one, they knew the plan of salvation, and they wanted it preserved for their future generations. And how would you go about doing that? I mean, you could write about it. Obviously, they had it written down someplace.
Mm-hmm. But they built it into the land that still sits to this day, all these years later. Because these mounds, and what people need to understand on an archaeological level, is they're not just mounded up dirt. They are engineered, just ingeniously engineered, so that they could stand the test of time. Because they did want this kept. They want it encoded in the land. And so this is basically an outdoor temple complex.
In fact, it's the largest temple complex in the world, even to this day. It's over 4 square miles in extent. There is no other temple by any other religion that is bigger than 4 square miles in extent. But that's how huge this thing is. This was the monumental effort to do this, and it would have taken thousands of people, many years probably, to do this work. Yes. But the thing that's so interesting is it has encoded in it several different geometric figures, and I'd like to have you kind of, if you would, just give us a quick overview. Now, there's going to be a lot more in-depth information. And the book just has just a little quick thing there. But you've explained this on some of your talks before, and those.
I'm actually going to produce and then I'm actually going to produce an actual DVD this spring of just this. So if you wanted just this, it'll be available. So that's kind of great.
Wonderful.
But what I will say about this is, we as members of the church who have been through a temple, in our LDS culture and religion, we know that originally we would move from room to room. We would literally learn something in one room, and then we would stand up and progress into another room, and there'd be greater light, and you'd sometimes ascend literally like up a few steps, or to give this idea and to convey these ideas of moving into greater light and knowledge and understanding, but you'd physically literally move. Well, what we have here in this temple complex is the ability for a great number of people to experience and learn this plan of salvation by moving from not just room to room, but these amazing works and I will start kind of like with this first one here, this circle, and that they could be taught and then move to the next phase of understanding and go through kind of like we did. And so what we find here, as I studied it and looked at this and began to research how these were made, for example, the striking.
So what does the circle represent symbolically?
Well, symbolically, at first it just looks like a circle, but then as I learned that the moat, wasn't a defensive, in a defensive earth mound or whatever, the moat's on the outside to prevent attack. Right. But this one, the moat lined the inside, and it was full of water, but the place where the water actually was inside that moat was painted gold. So we have this beautiful gold water, if you will, but this water that
it wasn't like paint like you would have paint. Right. It was actually, they had to go miles and miles away, find a particular kind of soil that was actually a yellowish goldish color, and they would have to get that soil and haul it all the way over here so they could line the inside of this thing, which, by the way, just the circular part of this thing is just huge. Huge. It is huge. I mean, it's just to haul enough soil to cover just a little small portion of it would be just a pretty monumental effort. Absolutely. So in other words, they were very vested in wanting to make sure that happened. It was very important for them to do that. They were willing to go to that work. Yeah. And why? Because what I believe they're creating, and as you look at this map, as I studied this map and studied how it was made and the history of it, and as far as the archaeology of it, it occurred to me as I'm looking at that perhaps, wow, it looks a lot like a womb. When you look at it, it looks like a human, a womb inside a woman. I've actually had Native Americans who have verified that. This and said, that this is that what is to represent. If you take a close look at it, basically it's round, but it has kind of a interesting. When it comes up, there's an entrance area that comes up, and basically that was the entrance area there, and then it comes in, and then on the inside of this thing was a structure. Yeah. Want to tell about the structure? Yeah. So that structure, and I'll let you talk about more about that briefly, and then we'll talk about more of the. Yeah, because, and just a couple other things, just kind of from the more macro scale of this thing. Essentially, what you have, if you can, and I'm trying to describe this because some of you are listening to this on podcasts, and so you can't see what we're saying. So, essentially, when we look at a book, for example, our eyes immediately go up to the upper left-hand corner because we read from left to right. But Hebrew is written the opposite direction, so they would go to the upper right-hand corner, and they tend to read in a counterclockwise rotation, or look at things in a counterclockwise rotation, whereas we look at things typically in a more of a clockwise rotation. This entire earthworks basically is set up in a counterclockwise rotation, beginning with this circular portion. The circular portion then has where the entrance is. It leads out into there's like two containment walls, if you will, as you come out. So you can't really leave that, but it directs you in a particular a tunnel, like a tunnel going into a direction there, and then that leads to another massive earthwork, which is in a square configuration. Yep. What does a square represent? So let's talk about that. So typically in symbology, round, anything round, circular represents heaven and things from on high, divine, and square represent the earth, the four corners of the earth square. Like Native Americans and their the four cardinal directions. So basically, what that's conveying to me, and things on a symbolic level, of course, are always very subjective. And whatnot. So there's no right, exactly right and wrong. These are suggestions that I'm going to give that came to my mind, and I've added them here. But so this. By the way, I think you're right. So we have this circle here, and you could say that it represents birth and being born here, right? And that once we are born, we come down, we progress down to earth. Here we are. The scriptures often talk about the four corners of the earth, and that's the representation of that. And so geometrically speaking, that's how you would represent earth in four corners. By a square. Okay. Absolutely. Or it could be a rectangle. Yeah, true. But most have four corners. Yes, four corners to represent the four cardinal directions. And so we come here, and then we get into this square, as you see here, and then representing earth life, but it's more than just that, because like we said, with the gospel of Christ is laid out very specifically throughout the Book of Mormon, but there's very specific steps, and so we talk about the earth life being
you come here, and then at that point you've entered into the gates, if you will, and then now that's where baptism. Okay, so then when you're born after 8 years or whenever you become baptized, and then but are you done? Are you there? Have you made it? No, you then must press forward with a steadfastness and faith, and so at that point you then begin your journey, if you will, so to speak, and we see this now at this point you're walking this path. You see on the map if you're able to watch this, and so there becomes this path, if you will, that is on the side of the path. There's this great pond. Now on this map it's a lot smaller, but at the time I learned this pond was ginormous, so it was quite much bigger than this.
Yes.
With time it's shrunk.
And by the way, the map that we were referring to is a map that was done in Ancient Monuments Mississippi River Valley. This is back in 1848 by Squire and Davis. It's one of the earliest maps. Other maps were done of this. Actually, it was actually surveyed about 3 different times. One of those was by David Wyrick back in 1860. And he was the town surveyor of this, and so there are several different maps, and they don't all agree 100%, but all of the major elements are there.
Yes. So if you picture a great big huge pond, and the thing that marks a pond that distinguishes a pond from other types of water is a pond is stagnant water, right? It's not being. There's no inlet or outlet with a pond. Right. And so what happens with a pond, if you're going to represent filthy water, if you're going to talk about Lehi's dream and vision and Nephi's, and the interpretation that Nephi was given, you're going to think, filthy water. That in this life, as you're walking the path that he talked about with the rod of iron, that there's this filthy water that's very close to this.
Which would also
path.
probably explain why Christ was not baptized in the beautiful clear waters of the Sea of Galilee, which I've swam in. I think you probably have too. But instead he chose to be baptized in the muddy River Jordan. I remember as a kid, why would he
living water
do that?
Living water,
because it has to be flowing, which is representing living water, moving living water.
Yeah, because still stagnant water becomes very dirty very quickly, very filthy. So we're in my mind, this is what we're seeing here represented by what on the map looks small, but at the time was this huge pond of stagnant water. And then as you progress, and the idea being to stay out of that pond of that filthy water and to stay on the path, and we think about Nephi, but to stay on that path that's straight and narrow, very narrow, as you can see. And then as you progress, you end up here at what's called the Great Octagon. And that's a fascinating work because it is so mathematically and astronomically aligned. It's unbelievable. In fact, the measurements that they were able to figure out, that they who built it, the architects of this earthwork, used the same measurements that were used to build the pyramids in Egypt.
Pyramid of Giza.
Yes. So the mathematical understanding,
which that is
phenomenal.
606 feet.
Yes.
And then 606 feet, basically, if you double that, basically it creates a square. And if you take that square and you rotate it, then that causes an 8-pointed side. And then if you tie each one of those up, then you create an octagon.
Yep.
Those of you who have ever had the opportunity to go to the Salt Lake Temple or to the San Diego Temple, the Salt Lake Temple, as you walk up to the front entry doors, there is a little symbol there that's emblazoned on the doors. It's basically a little square piece of glass, second little piece of glass, and it's rotated about 45 degrees, and on that is a little beehive. If you connected all the tips of all 8 of those little square, the tips of the squares, it would create an octagon.
Yep.
What is that symbol called?
The seal of Melchizedek. Are you talking about that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Cunibly talks about this.
Which is all over on the San Diego Temple as well, over 10,000 times.
10,000
If you look straight down on the San Diego Temple, it actually
it
creates
is.
a seal of Melchizedek.
It's in the fence. It's imprinted in the cement surrounding the temple. It's everywhere because this is a very powerful symbol. This 8-sided, what is called the seal of Melchizedek, because it represents the fact that that shape, this octagonal shape, represents mediation. Okay, so when you have an 8-sided tower, an 8-sided physical object, it denotes this mediation between heaven and earth. Now,
Well, if earth is represented by a square, and heaven is represented by a circle, then the geometric figure, the perfect transition between a square and a circle would be
Exactly.
The octagon.
Exactly. Which, what does Christ do for us? As one of his titles and roles, and one of the most important, is mediator. He mediates for us between the Father and us, and symbolically mediates between heaven and earth. He came down, he condescended, and became that mediator for us. Yeah. And so, in my mind, that's
kind of what temples are for.
Absolutely.
In fact, I want to remind people about the two temples that were the first temples of this dispensation, which were seen in vision by Joseph Smith, and those temples have the same kind of things that you're talking about here.
Yep.
If you take a look at the Kirtland Temple and Nauvoo Temple, the base of the spire is either a square or a rectangle, and that the top of it is either like a ball or a half dome, which is a representation of a circle. Basically, this is earth, this is heaven, and what's in between it?
An 8-sided tower in between. The clock tower in Nauvoo is an 8-sided octagonal-shaped tower that's mediating
and
heaven.
Called the seal of Melchizedek, basically. But this is an interesting thing, and I think probably a lot of members of the church know this. But the Melchizedek priesthood was not originally called the Melchizedek priesthood. It was called the priesthood after the holy order of who? The Son of God.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And if it was from the Son of God, then actually the Melchizedek priesthood is literally the priesthood of Jesus Christ. And who is the mediator between heaven and earth? Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is that seal of Melchizedek, if you will, and he is the mediator. Yep. And this is where some of the beautiful symbolism that you have been able to share with us has been just absolutely fabulous, Amberli.
Yeah, if you were able to pick one shape that represented the life and mission and purpose of Jesus Christ, you would find it in the octagon. And not only that, but it's 8-sided. 8 represents rebirth. How old are we when we are baptized?
8 years old.
8 is a very significant number when it comes to rebirth. And so, interestingly enough, there's several celestial rooms in our temples that are 8-sided. The Boise Temple, its celestial room is an octagon. So we get there, and then
he's got there's seal of Melchizedek right there.
Oh, there we are. Beautiful rendition there. So at that point, if we're true and faithful and we stay on our path, we don't fall into the filthy waters. Then we get to that point, shape. This octagonal shape, and we hopefully can enter in, and it's probably guarded by angels, and we need to have the tokens and the right things to know and say, and the knowledge and wisdom to be able to pass into there.
The sentinels that guard those places.
Yep, and in there.
And then it all leads to?
Yep, once in there, then at that point, exaltation is represented after that, because of course here's where we you can think about the temple and what's given there, the promises, but then being faithful to those you can then go through that out the octagon into what's connected.
For those of you who are listening, basically there's an octagonal shape and it's connected with like a little narrow neck, if you will.
Yes.
Narrow neck of land.
Neck. There we go.
Okay, that goes into a circular shape, perfect circle. And that one has no other entrance or exit. It's just only one way in.
It's an absolute perfect circle. And you can see it from above. I mean, it is so perfectly executed of a circle, in such a large, like you said, grand scale and space, and it's a perfect circle with no exit. So being there, you've reached exaltation, and you've reached the pinnacle, and there you are. And so I just picture the time with these Nephites. They were able to walk people through the temple ceremony, if you will, and the plan of salvation, and all of these things in this experience where they're experiencing it physically, viscerally, visually, tactilely. They're experiencing it, and I think it's also important to realize that the walls are built up high in these.
So you can't see.
So you can't see because in a temple, it's only for those who are initiated, those who are prepared, and you keep it sacred. Keep it sacred space. It delineates sacred space, and what's interesting is this space is known throughout, even to this day, for all these Native American tribes and whatever, that this space was kept sacred and not violated by any tribe for any means or any warfare anywhere. It was a kind of a hands-off zone for everybody, that this was known to be sacred and to never be desecrated with war or anything. That's why it still stands and exists like it is today, and it has an incredible feeling there as well. It's phenomenal.
There's two other small things that we want to just address, and that is that if you start again from the beginning, you have a circle representation of a womb.
Yes.
It comes out to a funneling, if you will, and then but that funnel doesn't quite connect directly to the square, which is representation of the earth. There's a juxtaposition of two funnels that kind of facing each other, and they don't really quite connect, which is representation of basically, as we understand it, the veil.
Yes, to me it said that there's this veil that
there's a veil that disconnects us from our pre-existence, and then we go into the earth, and there's 1, 2, 3 ways to get out of the earth. If you go counterclockwise, rotation through that. One of them goes up and kind of just has a little dead end place and doesn't really go anywhere. The next one goes up and we don't know exactly what happened. We think that the Raccoon Creek that actually runs through that area may have flooded and destroyed portions of that. We don't know exactly what happened, but we think there might have been some kind of a connection there with this particular little roadway, and it goes up and connects to a whole nother, a second road, if you will, a second path that goes from the earth, or basically the square, over to the octagon. And then there's the third path, which is kind of the more direct route. So according to our plan of salvation, how many ways out do we have out of this life? When we leave this life, basically we go to, when Christ was on the cross, he said to the one thief that was next to him, he said, "Today thou will be with me in paradise," right? So we know that paradise is one of those places. What's one of the other places? It's spirit prison. For those who have not been that faithful in this life, or have not really kept their first estate very well, they go to spirit prison. Those are the two main places. So why would there be a third one? Well, because of the ideas that you're going to make me do this, aren't you?
You're doing so well. Okay. I'm going to just let you finish.
Anyway, and the third one is basically the direct route for those who have had their work done for them while they're on this earth. So they're not just showing up without all the information that they need to make it through the sentinels. They're going to need to be taught those things. But not only that, somebody else is going to have to do it for them because they didn't do it while they're on the earth. And so that second route is the vicarious route. The main route is for those who have had their work done with them, and they're showing how they are going past this fountain of filthy water. Both of those routes ultimately end up at the seal of Melchizedek. And then from the seal of Melchizedek, there's only one way in. So what you have here basically is celestial, terrestrial, telestial. You have a pre-existence, which how many religions on the earth even believe in a pre-existence? You have a veil, you have the earth, you have paradise, you have spirit prison, you have a direct route, you have a vicarious route. You both go to the seal of Melchizedek, and then it ultimately is through the seal of Melchizedek, or through Christ, through the mediator, that we end up going to the celestial and becoming with our Heavenly Father. Now, everything is there, and it's in the right order.
Could this just be a wild coincidence?
You know what? The probability of that just happening by coincidence in the largest temple structure on the face of the earth, even today, and what other religion could possibly explain that?
No, and
it's 2,000 years old.
More. Yes, and what's interesting again for that is, like you said, you come in here to this octagon where he mediates for you, and that's the essential part here. That's where his role comes in, which allows you entrance into that great circle, this heaven. But look how big, and that's what's interesting. Look how big that great octagon is. It's one of the biggest structures on there. That's his power. That's the mercy. That's him mediating for you, which is so beautiful. And in other words, there's room for all. Right.
Just like in the podcast that we did with Chauncey Riddle, we were talking about how when we get to the other side and we come before the judgment bar of God, we're going to be standing there before God the Father, Elohim. And who's going to be standing there beside us? The Savior. And we won't be able to plead for ourselves because we don't have the power, because we didn't atone for our own sins. The only person who can plead for us is Christ. And so I can imagine how it will be to have Christ actually standing before God the Father and pleading for you personally.
Because he knows your heart like no other. And that's why this place here is so beautiful, as they lead these people in here and say, here he is. He will mediate for you. And then they usher them into this beautiful celestial place. And what a powerful way to teach that, right? I mean, how beautiful. And I want to, as an editorial thing, I want to add that when I looked at this and started to see this, it all started kind of making sense and jumping off. I went to an article written by Noel Reynolds, a great scholar, who wrote an article, I believe, in a BYU Studies magazine I read years ago, where he laid out he calls the doctrine of Christ. And it's a 6-step, very specific progression, the way that Christ himself lays it out, especially in 3rd Nephi. And so I actually took that, overlaid that on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I really credit Noel Reynolds for how he was able to really specify and lay out the doctrine of Christ as written in the text. But that's what makes it so profound and so real, is to see those exact steps in that order, like you said, exactly as it's found. And I want to add one other thing about this that's really interesting too. This, you have to understand, like Rod was saying, it's spread out of how many acres does it?
Well, 4 square miles.
Okay, so many acres, right?
Many, yeah.
So it cannot.
Hundreds of acres.
Yes, hundreds. It cannot be seen when you approach we've been there. When you approach these mounds and this, you can't, from our perspective as a human, we're on eye level, we can't see the whole thing, which is important, because that's how this works. When we come here and we're here, we can't see it all at once, but we can progress through it at each phase, which I think is important too. But anyway, we cannot see it, but guess who can see it all at once? If you have
from the drone,
a drone, or which they probably didn't have, but God himself can see it, and they were building it to him to please him. And so they used perfection, but they couldn't probably even enjoy their perfection, so to speak, because again, they're always eye level. I mean, their perfect circle. I would love for them to see how perfectly they did it. That's what I'm saying. Yes. They're building it with our, eye level perspective, but from heaven, it's perfect. And it's so wonderful that they knew and could do this and had the dedication and devotion in years that they built this.
And by the way, I have to give a shameless plug, because we have the most beautiful high-resolution aerial photography of this. It's in the DVD called Book of Mormon. Let's see, the chronology. Okay. Visualizing Book of Mormon chronology, which is the DVD that has about 40 or 50 of these sites that from high-resolution drone video, but especially this site, the Newark Earthworks, is just astounding. When you look at it. We actually have images from satellites to get directly overhead, because even with the drone, you can't get high enough in elevation because they have restrictions on how high you can fly the drone. You can't get high enough to get the entire thing in an image. And until you go to satellite level, because it's 4 miles that you're trying to shoot, and you'd have to be a long ways up to get that kind of a shot. So
there you go, a testament to
I hope
devotion.
You're enjoying this is some of the meat that we talk about, and the milk and the meat. This is it. Pretty heavy duty stuff.
Pretty good stuff. All
right, so let's go.
Our Nephites knew what they were doing, and they did it well, and it's amazing.
All right, so now we're gonna drop over here to page 327 of the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon. This is a little bit about this land. Another item that you didn't mention yet, and I think you were holding off
that's right.
until we were going to get to this.
Yep.
But there's something else beyond corn, wheat, and barley.
Yes.
That may give us some indications as to geography.
Yes.
And climate and things like that. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about this particular fruit?
Rod is talking about grapes, and they are absolutely
great.
They're great grapes. Grapes are great. They are essential to the law of Moses, but it gets even deeper than that, and we'll talk about that. But they are used throughout in the different, for example, in Feast of Tabernacles, grape wine is used on libations, which is it's poured out at a certain point in the ceremony. They're used in the daily offerings.
Wait a minute, are you saying that the Nephites had wine?
Well, King Noah sure had an abundance of it, didn't he? He was very fond of wine, and
the Nephites occasionally used it to get the Lamanites.
It was useful. It comes up in many points in the narrative, so it's very, very abundantly clear that it was there. And we know that they grew it because here we find in Mosiah 11:15, it came to pass that King Noah planted vineyards round about in the land, and he built wine presses and made wine in abundance, and therefore he became a wine bibber, and also his people. Yeah. So they loved their vino, okay? But that tells us that they had an abundance.
You sure they're not from Italy?
They had it in abundance. They could grow it. They could cultivate it and all of that wonderful things. Well, if you've ever driven up through the heartland of Ohio, you will see it looks like Napa Valley. Yeah. It is the most gorgeous display of vineyards you will ever see, probably outside of California in that area. But the point being, the climate is perfect for growing these grapes. Yeah. And a problem that is found down south in Mesoamerica is that climate is not conducive to it. There was a form of kind of a wild grape in an herb form that was kind of found thing. Anciently.
It was very, very rare.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah. It's not what we're talking here. And these were grown in abundance. And what is important about that is we know that they're there in the record because when the Vikings showed up in 1000 AD, they were stunned by not only the abundance of the grapes, but there were several, at least 3 different kinds. So much so that they actually nicknamed it Vinland. Wineland.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Wine.
Yeah. Vinland, yeah. Vineland. And so the land of the vines or land of wine. And so they documented at least 3 different types of grapes. Mm-hmm. And so and this is found, I document this. There's the fox grape, and then there's 2 other kinds that make just wonderful wine.
Red kind of the bluish color, and kind of a greenish grape.
Yeah, and so we learn in some of these books that I studied about the Western Vikings or the Westward Vikings, et cetera, and I document it. But that was there when they.
Where is that documented again? That's in the.
So it's in a book called Western Vikings. But
that's also in both of these. In both of these, yeah, talking about the wine and so forth. Yep.
Yes. And that they said themselves that it was called Vinland for the reason that grapevines grow there by themselves, producing the best wine. So this came from those who found it there in 1000 AD. Yeah. So it was there.
Now also this is on page 327, because if you take a look at the little gold bar here in the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon on page 326, this is from Alma chapter 55, and this is verse 8. It says, and when it was evening, I kind of alluded to this already, but basically this is a little escape. A situation here by the Nephites. Yeah, and when it was evening, Laman went to the guards who were over the Nephites, and behold, they saw him coming, and they hailed him. But he said unto them, Fear not, behold, I am a Lamanite. Behold, we have escaped from the Nephites, and they sleep. And behold, we have taken of their wine and brought with us.
Yes.
So whose wine was it? The Nephites' wine. And what did they do with it? They got the Lamanite guards drunk, and then they
put them to sleep.
Got out of there.
And then they were able to get
but not only that, what did they do? Remember that? They gathered, I think this is the one that they gathered their flocks and their herds together.
Oh, yes. Yep.
And then twice they did that. So they had to get them very good and drunk, because flocks and herds are not exactly quiet animals. No. I mean,
you're making an escape. It's pretty hard to do it quietly with a flock of sheep. But so this wine had to be very, very effective in keeping them asleep for a very long time.
It was the good stuff.
Yes. And so there's that. But I almost think the most compelling use or example of the importance of wine in the Book of Mormon is Christ himself in 3rd Nephi, when he shows up and he gives them the sacrament. And to do that, he did it twice, 2 days in a row, both days. One day, and then he did it the next day. And on the first day, he asked that the disciples that they would bring some bread and wine unto him. So he asked the Nephites there in 3rd Nephi, bring me some bread and some wine. And he broke it and blessed it and administered the sacrament to them. On day 2, this is what's interesting. He produced his own.
Oh, kind of like over in the old world.
Yep. So point being is they had it there for sure, but then he produced his own that next day. And he said these words. He commanded his disciples that they should take of the wine of the cup and drink of it, and that they should give unto the multitude that they might drink of it. He's commanding them. This is on day 1 when they went with their wine. So just to make sure.
By the way, that's 3rd Nephi chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, and then verse 8.
Yes, and so he's administering the sacrament, and in what I can only imagine was the most amazing, incredible. Can you imagine? And that he's commanding them to drink of this wine that they brought him. So as he's representing his blood as a part of his supernal sacrifice And what that represents, the blood that was so costly that he shed from every pore. And he likens that and uses wine to represent that to these people. Mm-hmm. Is wine and grapes important? Are they there? Would they be there in abundance? How important is that for them to have?
And also, even, I mean, I know that we've even talked about, or you've talked about before, just even the preparation, how they prepare the wine, how they take the grapes, how they put them into a vat.
Yes.
They have a washing of the feet, which is very interesting and symbolic in and of itself.
Yes.
And then they get into the wine vat, or the grape vat, basically, and they stomp those grapes. They stomp them and stomp them and stomp them. And I know this is some of the symbolism that is just so beautiful that you've told about. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, and remember, because he's talking about his sacrifice and what happened there, and he talked about how he trod the winepress alone. He trod the winepress. And so when you look at a wine press and you realize what's happening, and like what you described, and
it's crushing the grapes,
crushing and stomping and crushing, and they're crushed down, and then they're pressed again, and it's just it's an amazing experience what they do to get this wine and to get this juice, of course, that comes to wine.
Stained.
Yes, and then they get, of course.
Depending on the kind of grape it is.
Right.
But generally speaking, when they make like red wines and so forth, their feet will literally get stained.
Yes.
A bright red color. It looks like they're bleeding.
Yes, like profusely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so that in itself is so visually profound to even imagine. But yeah, this pressing of the wine this wine press is so interesting. And when we talk about the grapes of wrath, his wrath, and with some of those hymns, and it points to this, and how could we present some kind of substitute in that situation? How if we're not in North America where we have these grapes, how do then we think of?
But you said that the Mayans did have some kind of a substitute.
Well, they had an alcoholic drink that wasn't wine. Theirs was the early precursor for tequila, which was an agave drink, which is now what modern day tequila is made from. But it was came from these agave plants, which was
like pulque or something.
Yes, it was called pulque, Pulque, and they got it from these huge agave plants that look like overgrown aloe vera, basically. And so they could make they're huge, and then they could make this kind of frothy alcoholic beverage that they would drink and party with, etc. Because
they could make it into a foam.
Yes, they kind of foamed it,
snort it, right?
Yep. And so you see some of those graphics that you see down there in Mesoamerica, portraying this,
actually doing this,
this. But interestingly enough, you never see this wine. What we're talking about going on. This pulque stuff is happening a lot, but this is what's important. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that gives us some good background. I mean, there's a lot more to this.
Yep.
That I know that Amberli.
Yeah, we're just touching on surfaces. If you want to go deep, it's
deeper.
It's there. Deeper.
Yeah, deeper.
It's there. Yep.
Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about here is with Amberli is from if you have the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon, it's page 385, and on page 385. It's talking about this, but this is actually going into page 384, which is 3 Nephi chapter 3, chapter 4, and this is verse 7. So this is 3 Nephi chapter 4, verse 7. It says, "And it came to pass that they did come up to battle, and it was in the 6th month. And behold, great and terrible was the day that they did come up to battle. And they were girded about after the manner of robbers." Who are these people? The Gadiantans. "And they had a lambskin about their loins, and they were dyed in blood, and their heads were shorn, and they had headplates upon them, and great and terrible was the appearance of the armies of Gadianhi because of their armor and because of their being dyed in blood." Let's talk about this.
Wow, this is meaty, because this right there gives us a lot of information that's very relevant, not just to then, but to now. So just to set up the time frame.
They didn't mention at the beginning. They said they talked about asses and horses and goats and ox and cows and so forth, but they didn't mention specifically sheep in the very early part of it. But yet throughout the Book of Mormon, they talk about having flocks and herds of what?
Yeah.
And
yes.
You got to tell us about the sheep.
So, very, very, very instructive this verse is. It tells us a lot about who the Gadiantans were, what they were doing, and in the time frame they were doing it, which is very interesting that this event happened just 8 years before the
Christ
Savior
comes.
came.
Yeah.
So 8 years. I believe this is also because the Book of Mormon is such a warning and a relevant commentary and warning about our day, that we need to pay attention to when things happen.
Exactly.
In the scheme of this. So right before the Savior comes, we're having this event here with this great and terrible day with the Gadiantans. What is interesting about this is, first of all, the sheer number of lambs that were available to them. And that's very important, because when you read...
There were a lot of people. There were a lot of Gadiantans.
Yes. Well, if we read in a couple verses later, when the Nephites start to... once they repent and the Lord puts his protection around... We're talking about Laconius' people.
Right.
There was a siege going on. So Laconius had gathered... The Lord had told him to gather his people together and to
center of the land.
Prevent against this in the center of the land, because there's siege of the Gadiantans. And so we know numbers of Gadiantans, because as the Laconius' people repented and received the protection of the Lord, then they were sustained and protected to the point that the Nephites then were able to go out and slay the Gadiantans and the word is thousands, yea, tens of thousands. So we know
a lot of people.
We're talking about a lot of people who are wearing a lot of lambskins. So the first thing we pull from that is just the very obvious, that lambskins were very abundant and lambs were everywhere, and to be able to provide this kind of loin.
But why would they have so many lambs?
Right, because the lambs are so essential to the law of Moses, but they needed them. They grew them. They were so central to all of this. But here's what's interesting about this.
Yes.
Go ahead if you were going to say.
I was just going to say. I mean, they couldn't repent.
Oh, exactly. I see.
Without them.
Right. Yep.
So they were not. It wasn't just like they were growing them because they were going to have some lamb chops.
Right.
Okay?
Right. No, these were not for lamb chops. No.
Growing them
right.
So that they could rid themselves of their own sins.
Yes. And it wasn't just once a year. We talked about it on Passover, but actually these offerings were daily. And in fact, in Israel, we know that a lamb was sacrificed morning and night, every day. Mm-hmm. Not for everybody, but that was part of it. So yes, an abundance of lambs were needed for that exact point. Yeah. They became the symbol of repentance and forgiveness and sacrifice. So
what do you think the reason was that the Gadiantans decided that their costume of choice is? I mean, of all the things that they could wear, I mean, why not make it a buffalo skin, or a deer skin, or a beaver pelt, or something like that,
or a skunk? I mean, that black and white would be very attractive, right? That's right. And be very indicative of who they were, right?
Mink.
Yes, or mink.
Be more comfortable, probably.
Right.
Mink.
Well, that's what you need to understand. And Matthew Brown and Daniel Peterson wrote very good articles in literature about this. It was very instructive in my research to understand this, because you have to understand why they did pick that and where that came from. Well, you trace that back all the way back to Adam, when the Lord made skins of Adam, made skins for Adam and Eve of covering, and it was believed that they were lambskins.
Yeah, and by the way, they weren't cloth; they were skins. In other words, someone had to kill something.
Yes.
Who did the killing?
That represented that first sacrifice there after Eden, where they were shown, this is what's going to happen, and this is the lamb, and this is who he is, and it started to all be shown to them. So lambskins have always been indicative of that, going all the way back to Eden,
to the very beginning.
Garden of, yes. And so what happened, why they picked these, and Daniel Peterson talks about the Gadiantans. The other thing we need to understand about them is, yes, they were robbers, but we need to understand they were a very organized group of what he called the alternative church. Okay, because remember when Gideon writes his epistle to Laconius in his bold and brazen way, and join us, and why do you think you can stand against us, and we're great and we're numerous and everything, and he was literally the governor. He named himself the governor. These people were organized. Yes. They weren't just loose bands of savages. They were an organized alternative church. Yeah. That's instructive. And so, having said that, they had usurped the sacred garments, the symbolism and the symbols of these as kind of a, look, we have the legitimate power, look at us, like we have the sacred garments, we're the good guys. In fact, in his epistle, he makes the point, we're the good guys. Yeah. And as proof, they bandied about in their lambskins, they're aprons, if you will.
Yeah.
And when you trace back the importance of a lambskin apron, we see that all of the major prophets, from Isaiah on down, even John the Baptist was described as having an apron of lambskin. It's suggested in some of the other literature that Jesus, when he was washing the feet of his disciples, he had his apron on of lambskin. It's very, very symbolic, points directly to him and his sacrifice. So they're using it as they co-opted it, they hijacked it, as to say, no, we're the legitimate people.
But also at the same time, as they are making this statement that they're the legitimate people, guess what else? They're denying the Nephites from the ability to offer sacrifices.
Yep.
Because they're basically killing off all of their sheep, so they can't even offer sacrifices anymore, so they cannot even live their religion.
Well,
they're denying them.
Except luckily, and that would be true, except if you kind of remember back in the story, the Lord told Lyconius when he had him gather in the center of the land,
Right. So
he actually told him to take 7 years worth of their stuff for that very purpose. So that's a good point. So to kind of be able to keep doing this, that's how important it was. So in a siege, when you think about what you're gathering, no, right.
Yeah.
They're thinking, we're going to,
We're going to keep them from even practicing the religion, just like the Pharaohs were doing with the Egyptians.
Exactly, kind of mocking them. And so interestingly enough, another thing that comes out of that, of Daniel Peterson's article, which is so great, was he talks about the genesis, basically, of the Gadiantans hundreds of years previous to this, hundreds of years, goes all the way back to Alma's time. Because he's saying, in his explanation, which I think is brilliant, that remember Amulon, when they escaped, he being the head of the wicked priests of King Noah, King Noah's father, Zeniff, was a righteous, good king and man, and would have had the knowledge of these things, including this understanding of symbolism, sacred clothing, that kind of thing. And so King Noah would have inherited that from his father. And apparently in his wine-bibbing days, or at some point, he goes off the rails and decides to become what he became, King Noah, which eventually brought on his own death, prophesied by Abinadi. But the point is in the meantime, they had access to this holy, sacred knowledge and truth as these wicked priests who, when they escaped, as cowards did, up into the mountains, and they burned King Noah, but then these priests escaped. And what did they do? The first thing they did, instead of going back to their wives and children and being honorable men, they went and found the 24 Lamanite princesses and took them and forced them to marry them. But what Peterson points out, which I think is, like I said, so brilliant, is that was the actual start of the Gadiantans. And they just survived throughout the how many hundred years, and were the bane of the Nephites' existence, because they literally, legitimately had claim to the truth at one point.
And they were the priests in the temple, basically.
That's right.
with King Noah.
Right.
He was. They were part of his court.
Right. Probably had been part of his father, King Zeniff's court, who, again, King Zeniff, remember, was good and righteous.
Right.
Noah was the one that went off. So who knows how long these priests had been there, what they knew, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe that's why Alma did respond to the truth when he heard it. Who knows? But the point being is, so Alma, makes his way and starts, baptizing in the church. But then we've got these wicked priests that have this knowledge, have these likely have these lambskins, and that becomes their little, in their secret combinations and whatnot. This is passed down, and this is why we're legitimate, and we have legitimate claim to the truth, and we have the holy garments, or however they want to say it. But so hundreds of years later now, here in 3rd Nephi, they're bold in writing letters and epistles. We are who we are. And that's why. And so it's really interesting to look at that. And so again, to take this out of this event, this amazing incident, and take it and put it in another location where lambs have never been found anciently, have never been. There's no evidence whatsoever.
So is there evidence here in North America? I mean, yes.
Yes, there is. That was probably my biggest piece. I thought, if I absolutely have to find archaeological evidence for these lambs, because to me, along with the barley, I keep saying smoking gun, but they're kind of my other smoking gun, if you will. Yeah. And so as I searched and poured through the research, I came across a book by a man named William Ritchie, and he was just the preeminent archaeologist of New York back in the 1950s, and a brilliant scientist, and he wrote a book called The Archaeology of New York. Yeah. And he detailed all of his findings and where they were found, and in great detail. And in Kip Island, New York, western New York, right at the base of Hill Cumorah, he found evidence of domestic sheep.
Domestic sheep, yes.
Yes, and they were able to date the bones, of course, and what they found was that they were dated about 100 AD. So we know that sheep were raised in that area in western New York, in around 100 AD, and we have the bones to prove it.
And by the way, the images that you can see on page 385 in the book here, these are stone engravings. Basically, these are little stone, kind of like amulets, if you will, and they are to us it looks very much like sheep. So we have some pictures of sheep and different profiles, and then these rocks basically that have been carved to look like essentially a sheep. And these are in several different, not just one or two, but in several different museums back in the Midwest. So we know that they had sheep. Another great indication is that the Hopewell Culture National Historical Site in Chillicothe, Ohio. There is a copper goat horn. And so obviously they must have known what a goat was. They must have known what a goat horn was, because they made one made out of copper that looks just like a goat horn.
Yes.
So these ancient people, they definitely knew what sheep were and goats and so forth. And so that gives us some credibility as far as the Book of Mormon is concerned, that the animals and plants of the Book of Mormon are not, they have not been misnamed.
No.
They are exactly what the Lord, I think the Lord knows what a horse is, and I think the Lord knows what a sheep is, and I don't think that that He's got those mixed up.
Yes. And I want to add too that in the Book of Mormon, you're not just going to find reference to sheep in this incident. It's just where they're most numerous, but you're going to find reference to sheep throughout. Now, let me explain a little bit about that, because Moroni talks, and when he was talking about an analogy, he talked about being around, they were talking about sheep and lambs and being innocent like lambs, and they were used as metaphors and different things throughout. But Alma 5, I do a whole presentation on that called Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, and that really goes into this aspect of the Gadiantans and wolves, or in sheep, but also the importance of the fact that Alma 5's sermon, that great sermon, is about the great shepherd and his flock and his sheep. And he's talking about us. And then he goes on to warn the people in that great sermon in Alma 5 to warn them of the wolf. And that the wolf seeks always to devour the sheep. Now, what's interesting about wolves is that's another animal, and I don't even talk about it in this book, but in this I do. Wolves are indigenous to North America, and they've never been found in Mesoamerica, but they are a North American animal, and I talk more about that in detail. But the point being is,
when the fact that they use that metaphor as wolves in sheep's clothing, and obviously they knew what wolves were.
They knew what wolves were, and he was warning, and he was giving them such a warning that they could completely understand and comprehend, because they lived amongst them. And then at some point, he stops kind of mid sermon and then kind of looks out and directs his message to the shepherds that were there in his audience. He goes, now I'm going to look at you shepherds and talk to you, because you know what I'm talking about. So now he's directing his message at shepherds. Now, again, what's interesting about that, so now he's talking about sheep and lambs and shepherds and wolves and how to become into his fold, in the fold of the great shepherd and the good shepherd, and what that means. And he's very, very specific about, if you're not of the good shepherd's fold, then you are of the devil's. He's very, very clear cut on that. But the point is he's directing this message at the people who would totally understand and be able to assimilate these ideas of sheep and wolves, because they lived amongst them. If you're going to teach and warn a people and spend all those pages and time on this sermon that he said came directly from God after fasting and praying much, and it was all in the energy of his soul that the Lord gave him exactly what to say, those words are going to be so inspired directly from the Lord. You're going to use things and those words and animals that those people could understand. It was a warning. And a warning loses its efficacy, its effect, if you are saying something that these people have never seen.
If you're from North America and somebody's saying, watch out for those Tasmanian devils.
Right. Or the unicorns.
Those unicorns. You got to watch out for them, because, but you're never going to experience them. So
it means nothing.
Zero meaning.
That's right.
But there's even more to that. In fact, you make one of the most beautiful and impassioned, I don't know what even the best word to call it, but basically have an understanding of the significance of these sheep, and how they would be utterly meaningless if they didn't have sheep, number one, if they didn't have access to these sheep, and all of the other things that go along with the laws of Moses, and what that means to these different prophets in the Book of Mormon.
Yes. Well, and that's a great way to kind of bring this full circle and wrap this up, and kind of bring this all perfectly together in the fact that not only, like I was alluding to earlier, were sheep used as, in specific, practical, pragmatic ways and references to, but more importantly, and this is probably one of the most important aspects of this whole work, is that I put the number of verses, I can't remember, but it's in my presentation here, of how many verses that the prophets, whether it be Alma, Moroni, Mormon, Nephi, they talk about the importance of being washed clean in the blood of the Lamb. Mm-hmm. That was always this phrase that directed straight to him, to Jesus Christ, to Gethsemane, to his atonement, to the blood that he shed, and that the way that we are made clean is in the blood of the Lamb. And then he'd say, wash your garments in the blood of the Lamb. Make them white in the blood of the Lamb, throughout the whole book. Now, how important is understanding a lamb and the blood that he's talking about, and how beautiful of a metaphor and the imagery that comes to mind when those prophets were begging the people to wash to have their garments made white in the blood of the Lamb, and to be cleansed by the blood of the Lamb. And that's, to me, the most compelling part of understanding the Lamb's position and place in this book. Yeah. Because that is our key. That's the way to understand him and what he did for us. Yeah. So
that is wonderful. And I'm not sure if I should even want to bring this up, but the alternative to sheep in the Mesoamerican setting has been said to be an alpaca or an agouti, both of which are basically rats, rodents. Yeah. And if that was the alternative, I guess number one is, does the Lord really accept alternatives? And if he does, is a rat a acceptable alternative to a lamb?
Well, that one hurts a little bit because yeah. So as I've alluded to earlier, what has been problematic in Book of Mormon location and in geography for some of the other models is because they've never had any evidence of sheep being able to be raised there, especially due to climate. We're talking wool and sheep, Scotland, and you think of cold, and you need some colder climates. They don't do well in rainforests. But anyway, so when you're putting a location anywhere that does not produce evidence that sheep were ever there and lambs, you have a problem. And so to address that, some scholars that are the proponents of other geographical locations have suggested that because they weren't there and they weren't, and they're acknowledging, we don't have the sheep and the lambs here.
Yeah, there's no frescoes. There's no evidence. There's no bones.
We're looking for bone. There's just nothing, and so therefore they've had to produce what one scholar has called candidate apples, animals that were on the scene that were available, so that they could say, well, when the Lord said lambs, actually, this is what he meant, because they had to go with what's available there in Mesoamerican. The closest thing they could find were two versions of a guinea pig, both being rodents. One was called an agouti and one was an alpaca, and they were basically a 10-pound guinea pig and then about a 20-pound guinea pig. But a couple things that come to mind there. First of all, rodents are expressly forbidden in the law of Moses to start with. So these people would not...
They're unclean.
Would not only not touch them, they wouldn't eat them, they wouldn't have nothing to do with a rodent.
And if they did, they would have to go through a lengthy cleansing, whole thing.
Right. And okay, so just off the top there that excludes it. But then you go deeper and you start looking at the symbolic levels. Well, are those agoutis and alpaca? Or alpacas, not alpacas, pacas, P-A-C-A? Are they white? Are they spotless? Are they a 1-year-old male? Animals that are white and spotless? No. But that's just as important to the symbology as almost anything. This idea of this young male white spotless lamb, and then they want to present a brown mottled looking spotted guinea pig that's a rodent and say, well, we didn't have these, so surely they just substituted with these.
Yes.
And that's just a really hard pill for me to swallow, because It doesn't make sense on the law of Moses level, on a symbolic level.
Well,
and
it didn't go so well for Cain.
No, when the Lord, no, that did not go well. When he specifies what is to be sacrificed and why, he has a reason for it.
Yes.
And I don't think he suffers substitutes very well.
Yes.
We can see that throughout the record in the New Testament and Old Testament. But the point being is, it's hard for me to believe that the Lord would take these people there and say, oh, you're not going to find lambs, but that's okay because, you've got these rodents, but, they actually violate the very law I wrote. So we're kind of in a conundrum here, people. That's just not how I see it going down. I'm being a little dramatic there, but having said that, I see up here in North America that...
Well, the thing is that they would have to actually have a lot of substitutes because they'd have to substitute for wheat. They would have to substitute for barley. They would have to substitute for grapes. They would have to use the foamy agave plant stuff instead of actually having grapes. They would have to substitute for sheep. They had no cows or oxen, which are also used as substitutes, or goats. Right. Which, by the way, were also used as these things. Yep. So basically, they have to substitute every single thing except for palm leaves in order to live the law of Moses.
And the 7-day calendar, too.
Why would God lead a covenant people to a promised land that was completely devoid of every single thing except for one that they needed to have and they were commanded to live? Commanded. And then send them to that place.
Yes. And not only were they commanded to, I got to go to Jacob because it wasn't just this one way, here's the commands, I'm a harsh God, and this is it. It was a gift to them. And Jacob articulates this better than anybody in the most beautiful way, and I just encourage anybody to read that Jacob, in fact, can we go to that? Because I feel like that's a great place to end and a great place to wrap this up because it is so beautiful. The way he describes and articulates the purpose and the meaning and connection that they personally had to the law of Moses is just profound, and it's just really worth reading. And he says this. Let's see. It's let's see. I have it marked here if I can just find it. Right here. I believe it's Jacob 4:7. I believe. So. Okay, here it is. Yep, Jacob 4. Okay. So this starts in Jacob 4, chapter 4, and if I could just read these verses, they're powerful and worth hearing. For this intent have we written these things, that they may know that we knew of Christ, and we had a hope of his glory many 100 years before his coming. And not only we ourselves had a hope of his glory, but also all the holy prophets which were before us. Behold, they believed in Christ and worshiped the Father in his name, and also we worship the Father in his name. And for this intent we keep the law of Moses, it pointing our souls to him. And for this cause it is sanctified unto us for righteousness, even as it was accounted unto Abraham in the wilderness, to be obedient unto the commands of God, and offering up his son Isaac, which is a similitude of God and his only begotten Son. Wherefore we search the prophets, and we have many revelations in the spirit of prophecy. And having all these witnesses, we obtain a hope, and our faith becometh unshaken, insomuch that we truly command in the name of Jesus, and the very trees obey us, or the mountains, or the waves of the sea. So he goes on to talk about more about that, and it's beautiful, and I suggest they all read it all, but the point being here is it pointing our souls to him. And he talks a little bit more and kind of talks about it being, they delighting in it, but they loved it because it was their connection to him. And so they were happy to live it, and they were grateful he provided a way for them to live it. And they gave him thanks for that.
And it kept them pointing their lives and their thoughts and their hopes and their desires toward him. For 1,000 years. Yes,
to the point that their faith was so strong in this, in how the way that it pointed to them, that he said the mountains would move. I mean, you heard Jacob. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of faith that they were able to cultivate and nurture and maintain based on their keeping and understanding of this law. Mm-hmm. Now, is that not a gift? It's not a prison sentence. It's a gift. And when they have that gift, they're so grateful to live it and have everything they need. Because God is an abundant, loving, omniscient God. And that's what we find in this book, and the evidence bears it out. And we have physical, actual evidence right here in North America that speaks to every one of these things and says, these people were here, their lambs were here, their temples were here, and here they are.
And we have the evidence that they had all of these things, and that they also understood the very plan of salvation, which is the underlying foundation behind the whole thing. The whole thing. So this is just beautiful. Amberli, listen, I just want to thank you for dropping in and coming and letting us have this opportunity to have you share some of this amazing research that you've spent years in accumulating, and you're getting it basically very refined and kind of filtered down to just the most precious nuggets. And I hope that our audience out there will appreciate the fact that that there has been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into this, and we appreciate that very much. And thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you'll again join us for our next podcast here. We also want to just take just a second and thank Mike and Nancy James and Latter-day Media for putting all these things together for us and helping us to have the availability to be able to bring this to you. Just as a closing thing, can I hand me your DVDs? So the DVDs basically here, if you'd like to learn more about this information, we've covered about, we've only had a couple of hours here.
About 10%.
Together. So about 10%. So if you want to get really into some information, it's Jehovah's Holy Days in the Heartland of North America. Then this is the second one that you did, which is called 5 Scriptures that Validate the Heartland Model for the Location of the Book of Mormon. Phenomenal. I mean, I love them all, but I mean, this is a personal case. I like that one. And the Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. And that one is really very powerful. If you'd like to see these, you can get these from our bookstore. But you can also we'll be streaming a lot of Amberli's other presentations. These are just 3 out of a dozen presentations that she has done, and we don't have them all up yet. So be patient with us. But we're going to have as many as we can get up of Amberli's research, and you can go and you can. It's like $8 a month or something. You can access all of these things, and then a portion of that will go to her to be able to help her to be able to continue her ongoing research into this areas, and we can bring forth the evidences of the Book of Mormon, like Elder Holland said in his now hopefully famous talk. Those of you who are familiar with this podcast have heard that part, where he said that that we need to be bringing forth the evidences of the keystone of our religion, even the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. And if I can just add one more thing to what Rod, and thank you for having me on, but that I hope if you've got nothing else tonight out of this or anything I've said, you've maybe just caught a glimpse of my passion or my love of this, because it goes right back to President Benson quote that we started with, which is the power that comes in to your life and just illuminates every part of your life and blesses every part of your life. And I get to say that it has, and you can kind of see it in the passion of my work, because truth is truth, and it liberates our souls, and it enlightens us, and it enlivens us, and it gives us hope. And what could you want more than that? And it's found right here in this book. So I just would say, go back. President Benson right on. There's power in this book, and it comes into your life.
Well said. Thank you, Amberli. Good night, folks.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Book of Mormon Evidence Podcast. If you like this Come Follow Me supplemental study, click the like button and share it with your friends. Be sure to go to bookofmormonevidence.org, which is a hub with all the links that you would like to the podcasts, to upcoming events, the store, 200 plus answers about the Book of Mormon, as well as links to our streaming site, which now has over 100 new videos from our virtual expo. If you want to see the expo, go to comefollowme2020.org, and you can also see them on the streaming site, bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com.